I remember about 15 years ago. It must have been around the year 2006. I was ridiculed by a bunch of people for still using a Discman. Considering that the CD was initially introduced in 1982, that medium had a lifespan of 25 years before it turned from cutting edge to something people apparently made fun of. How long does it take today for something to get so old-fashioned that you get ridiculed for it? Whatever the exact answer, maybe we as individuals should start to turn this game around and ridicule others for only ever buying the latest thing that will probably have lost its value 2 years from now. In that sense, we are here at this scrapyard to retrieve items that have been discarded but shouldn't have ended up here in the first place. So let's see then what we find. Down at the bottom of this container I spotted a rather modern looking cordless drill, and I will keep that. This black shelf here is probably from a store of some kind, and I think it will make a good addition to my workshop as well. Down in this old bathtub someone dumped a bunch of car stereo equipment, and these two radios are something special and I will buy them as well. And this looks like a box that you can put on the back of your truck, for example, and it could also be a good storage box for my garden. It's a keeper. In this box here I found a stylish old fan, just what I need at the moment. And here is something really awesome, another old school signal horn, and I will certainly buy that as well. And what do we have here? Looks like a small ATV, and of course we're going to play around with that as well, so let's get back to the workshop then. As usual, we'll start with one of the simpler jobs. A pretty stylish fan, which, judging by its outer appearance, was probably designed and built in the 1970s. It is labeled Astron Taurus and was apparently made in Spain, which might be a first in any of my videos, to be honest. So my greetings go out to the viewers in Spain. Have you ever heard of that company? Leave a comment below. In typical fashion, the power cord was cut and we're simply going to replace it. Now, in some cases, a cut power cord can be a sign that a certain item didn't pass a safety test and that the cord was then cut. But with scrap, and even with stuff you find on the streets these days, it is way more likely that the cord was cut to sell its content as copper scrap. And as expected, the fan simply spins up and even oscillates. There just appears to be nothing wrong with it. And it's beyond me why you would throw something that stylish away, even if it wouldn't work. The next patient is this Makita brand cordless drill. It's a DHP 482, which is an 18-volt hammer drill that is still sold by Makita, and this one is around 2 or 3 years old. There are rust spots on the chuck and on that clip. The cause of the rust was probably the rain pouring on it after it had ended up at the scrapyard. Let's do a brief test with this 18-volt battery pack though. And you can probably hear that that doesn't sound right at all. And at least I can smell certain olfactory emissions I would describe as charred magnet wire. So I proceed by taking it apart, and I'm doing that using one of the drills I converted in my last Repair-A-Thon, which I recommend to watch as well. This is the 23rd episode of this series, by the way, and all other episodes are linked down in the video description. You can find them there. And we can see already that there is also rust on the inside. Here on the stator of this brushed DC motor, as well as on the lamination of the armature. The rotor windings have severe heat damage, and this is the cause of the malfunction. It would be possible to rewire the rotor with new magnet wire, but with the additional rust on the rotor and a very crusty looking bearing on top of it, a new replacement rotor is the best choice. And fortunately, Makita parts are readily available. And for about 20 euros I was able to acquire a new one. But before I get on with repairing that motor, I proceed by cleaning the enclosure from the inside, as well as the gearbox and the brushes. The rust on the stator pack is first cleaned by hand and then wire wheeled before the rotor is then inserted into the old stator pack. The motor is reconnected to the gearbox and the whole machine is put back together. Time for another test then. The drill seems to run normally again, but the chuck is still rusty. But at least on the outside, that can be taken care of rather quickly now that the motor is running again. And I must say that I'm actually quite impressed by the performance of this drill. Let's just hope it holds a little longer this time around. Our next item is this old signal horn or klaxon. I'm starting by cleaning it, and I'm almost certain that it works. It was made by SEL, which is short for Standard Electric Lorenz, which back in the day was part of ITT. The power consumption according to the nameplate should only be around 15 watts, and these things sure generate a lot of noise for having such a low power rating. Upon opening the plastic cover, which also has a rubber seal, we find the mechanism inside in pristine condition. This horn is based on a vibrating steel diaphragm that is moved by two cylindrical electromagnets or solenoids and a self-interrupting contact, so to speak. All it needs is an AC voltage and it will keep itself in motion. Upon connecting a power cord, we can have a first brief test. When testing one of these things, make sure to wear ear protection. And indeed, it works just fine. I want to set up an alarm system around the shop, and I want a very loud horn, but also an optical signal that can be seen from the street. And in order to add this to the klaxon, I have just the thing. This rather whimsical looking signal light apparently came from a runway on an airport in East Germany or another of the Eastern Bloc states back in the days of the Soviet Union. The German name for this type of signal light is apparently Hindernisfeuer. And you can also find them on smokestacks or other tall structures signaling a possible obstacle for low-flying aircraft, for example. I want to combine the signal horn and the signal lights to one unit, but I want the lights to flash rather rapidly and the klaxon to generate slower periodical bursts rather than one long uninterrupted signal. For that I will now build an Arduino-based circuit that I will integrate into the old enclosure. Upon connecting the old light bulbs to the isolation transformer, we can see that they still work. Having a really important job, I can imagine that these bulbs were designed to have a very long life. But LEDs will be better suited for periodical flashing than these incandescent light bulbs, and that is why I have now started to solder a number of red LEDs in clusters onto small pieces of perf board. Since the horn will be fastened to a wall facing the street, it is not necessary to have a light source that will emit light equally all around in all directions. Someone standing in the street watching at the source of the noise must be able to see the flashing light. Normally, I would recommend to add a current limiting resistor to every LED, but in this case I connected a few LEDs in series and then have several branches run in parallel, running on a 12-volt power supply using just a few power resistors, limiting the current to those branches. The resistors are oversized, but they were simply what I had at hand here. When you want to do it right, you have to make sure that the current through every branch of LEDs connected in series has its own resistor, limiting the current for all the LEDs in that branch. Two little bipolar transistors rated at 500 milliamps maximum current will be used to switch the LED clusters, because the I/O pins of this Arduino Nano clone here cannot provide enough current for a load like that. After that, the microcontroller board can be programmed to flash the LED clusters individually or both at the same time at any interval that might make sense here. And that's what it looks like from a meter away, from 5, and from 25 meters away. Good enough, I guess, at least in the dark. In the next step, I removed the old sockets and glued the LED boards in their place. The next step is now to switch the klaxon on and off with the microcontroller as well. It's an AC load directly running on the mains, while the LED clusters run on a 12-volt DC power supply. For switching AC loads, relays or triacs would be the most common choices. For many applications I have come to appreciate triacs. They are quick, inexpensive, and they have no mechanical parts that can wear out. But unlike a relay where coil and switches are isolated from each other, using a triac would force us to create a connection between the ground of the microcontroller and the mains. Well, unless you isolate the triac from the rest of the circuit, that is. This can be done with a small driver transformer or with an opto-isolator. A special form of opto-isolator is an opto-triac, like the MOC 3063 that I'm using here. In order not to get deaf during the programming process, I'm using a 230 volt light bulb as a placeholder for the signal horn. Just like with the LEDs, it is now possible to switch the Klaxon, or here the light bulb, on and off at various intervals. But the microcontroller and the LED clusters still need a power supply, and that's why I decided to integrate a small flyback converter into the old enclosure as well. A PCB like this must be properly insulated from the enclosure, and you should also connect the enclosure to protective earth. In a final step, I waterproof this assembly by closing holes with MS polymer, and also build a little roof that will hopefully add further protection. Now, in order to act as a proper alarm system, more elements like motion sensors, IP cameras or remote control would have to be added in the future. But for now I'm happy if this component of that possible system is loud and can flash, so I'd say it's time for a test. Let's take a brief look at those two car radios then. These are both relatively old-fashioned radios from the 1990s. They are for radio and audio cassette only, and the casual observer might think that they are worthless because they can't play CDs or MP3s and of course have no Bluetooth capabilities. When in fact they are actually sometimes more valuable than radios which have all those features. But it does not so much depend on the features than what car they belong to originally. See, these are both rather rare original BMW radios, and if they work, they are worth a pretty penny, because they are collector's items for people who restore those BMWs now or maybe in the future. Up here you can see the standard connectors we usually use around here. The odd proprietary connectors BMW used here make it a little harder to test them. But essentially, you just need a 12-volt power supply, one loudspeaker, and a cassette tape. Since I test car radios a lot, I built this tester a few years back, and there also is a video about that build in the video description. It can supply 12 volts to various pins selectively, measure the current that the radio draws, has a loudspeaker with selector switch for left, right, front, and rear, and some other features. I found the pinout for these radios online, and you can find that for almost any car radio. I also improvised a few wires that will fit onto the pins on the back of these radios. They are just crimp connectors from a standard box of cable lugs. All you really need is, in this case, to supply 12 volts to 2 pins, then connect one to ground, and 2 more wires to connect at least one loudspeaker to at least one of the outputs. The radio asks for a code, and normally only the owner is supposed to know that code. But in today's world you can just buy the codes on eBay from someone who is in possession of the software that can generate the code from the serial number of your device. I think I paid $3. And I forgot to connect an antenna. I'm just using a piece of wire here. So that's Guns N' Roses, but I can't play that because of copyright's, okay? But you can see here, that works. As you can see, the sound quality ain't great, but it's probably because of the cassette, not because of the radio. So what you can do now is to connect these wires here to the different loudspeaker outputs, the 4 ones, and just check if it works. And I've already done that here. So you can fast forward, you can reverse, you can play. It receives radio, so I don't think there's any problem here. And it's essentially the same with the second radio. Both radios work just fine, a great score. So in case you own an original radio like that came with the car when it was new, just keep it for a few more years and it might eventually become a collector's item as well. And what you've all been waiting for, the electric ATV. Well, at least it used to be electric before the motor, battery and almost everything else electric was stripped from it. Judging from the size of it, it's clear that this is basically a toy for children. It's not the cheapest toy though, since it actually has a steel frame and proper tires and so on. This could be a great platform for an oversized RC car, but of course I will also try to drive around on this thing. I start by removing the plastic covers, and I will not reinstall them. Next, I'm cleaning the frame, and this allows us to have a closer look for a moment. It has 2 disc brakes in the front and also used to have a disc brake on the rear axle. Also connected to that axle is a sprocket or chain wheel where an electric motor can be connected. And it was actually not a big problem to get replacement parts. A 36-volt DC motor rated at 800 watts, plus the speed controller and a pedal for only $60. It also came with 2 different sprockets. I'm choosing the smaller one for more torque. The motor can simply be fastened on this red plate here, and you simply have to put tension on the chain before mounting it in place permanently. I had busted one of the tires and needed replacement. It actually turned out that it was cheaper to just get an entire replacement wheel for $20. In the next step, I connected a 36-volt electric bicycle battery pack to the ATV and experimented with a self-made speed controller. But the results were too violent, so I installed the speed controller that I had bought before.
Let's go!
And well, what can I say? You can actually drive with this thing. You can even drive so fast that it gets kinda scary, but mostly because it's way too small for an adult and you feel like you could roll over at any minute. So yeah, as you can see, I only patched this together with a bunch of zip ties and it can't stay like this permanently, but I think you'll see this thing again in a future video. So I hope you liked this little video, and if that is the case, then please give it a like to let me know that I should produce more of this type of content. And if you want to support this channel more actively, you can make a donation via PayPal, link down in the video description, or become a supporter on patreon.com/tpai. See you soon. Hello, you who waited past the credits, because here's a little extra for you. I don't know if you've seen the video, but a couple of weeks ago I made a video titled My Hunt for a Cabin in the Woods. In that video we explored a number of abandoned houses and cabins that I had found in the forest. This one here, out of the 4 or 5 objects that I had shown, seemed to be the most mysterious one, as it had basement rooms that I couldn't enter at the time. But now, weeks later, a friend and I have returned to solve this mystery. Before we could actually enter the basement, we first had to free that, well, manhole-sized hole in the ground that would lead us down. There was an old, really rugged door that we first carried out of the way. It was made from red wood with, like, steel reinforcements on it. And then we pulled this piece of spruce out of the basement, which blocked the way. And now we were able to actually lower down a ladder that my buddy had brought. So we climbed down into the basement, and what we found here was a weird mixture of, for one thing, children's toys, which well, kind of made me concerned, because I really hope that no child was ever trapped down here, which would be really screwed up. But I think it's rather the case that children just played down here, which is also a little scary, but this place is not that far away from the next settlement. Now, going into this next room through an opening that is unusually low, I would say 1.5 meters, so that's lower than even a small human would be. And I don't think that this is a normal doorway. Over here, we might have found the remains of someone eating and drinking and probably also making fire, which is not a good idea down here, I guess. And then we found this third room here, which was basically empty, but for two, well, let's call them vent holes. So I'm still not sure what happened here. I still believe that this might have been some kind of water storage room, but it could be a bunker. It could just be that this place was plundered at some time. So I don't know if you've seen the original video. If you haven't, then I recommend you do so. I'll also put the video down in the video description. And I'd just like to hear your opinion if you still think that this might have been a bunker, because I am none the wiser. So, this time, for real, see you soon.